So the other side of the ADAS diagram is aggregate supply. This is a diagram, a production possibility curve or frontier, and we spoke about this in the micro presentations, and it's representing the frontier itself, represents the maximum output of an economy, and that's really what aggregate supply is looking at. So we've done a lot of these, we don't need to do all of them. We're looking at aggregate supply, why aggregate supply might shift, and we're going to get onto the equilibrium as well, hopefully, in this session. So the shape of the aggregate supply curve, it's really weird. This Keynesian aggregate supply curve that we learn about, or I'm talking about in this presentation, you might look at neoclassical one, so it's a bit different from this. But aggregate supply just represents the total amount that producers in an economy are willing able to supply at a given price level at a period of time, a specific period of time. So we've got this shape. It starts off horizontal, then it bends, and then it goes vertical after a certain point. And this shape actually is influenced by the level of spare capacity in the economy. So at this point it's perfectly elastic, and we've got a lot of spare capacity in the economy. You can increase your output without any effect on the price level. But as resources become scarcer at Y to Y1, so it's this point where it's curving, you are having to employ less efficient workers, less efficient machinery, and the increases in output, the marginal increase in output is reduced, and so you get this upwards pressure on the price level. And then at Y1 it's perfectly inelastic. All resources are employed at this point, all resources are being used, and this vertical point is a bit like saying it's the same as actually the PPC, the line on the PPC. It's the maximum output your economy can produce. So what causes shifts in aggregate supply then? Well, in the short run, and we don't always make the distinction between the short run and the long run in the AS course, but it does become important in the A2 course. But in the short run, it's changes in the costs in the economy. So if costs reduce, aggregate supply should increase, and if costs increase, aggregate supply should reduce or shift inwards. But in the long run, it's the changes in the quantity and the quality of your resources in your economy. So your factors of production, really, your land, labour, capital and enterprise. And so there's a long section in the book about this, what can increase these resources. I've just put a few points here. So in terms of the quantity, you should be able to increase the discovery of new land or new oil fields. There would, traditionally, you think about why do countries go to war? Not maybe now, but years and years ago, why do countries go to war? And it was to kind of, if you think about Britain, its colonies, call them colonies, but so it makes it sound like less bad than it actually is, but it's really just like invading a country and taking all their natural resources. So yeah, technically speaking, you can increase your quantity of land by colonising other countries, but is it ethical? No, not at all. So it's not a policy we'd promote these days. But increasing the quality of land, fertilisers, anything that cleans up the land or makes it more productive. Labour, though, it's really labour, capital and enterprise that we kind of focus on in seriousness. So immigration would increase the quantity, higher proportion of women entering the labour force, or an increase in the birth rate would increase the quantity of workers, whereas quality is determined by your education and your training, and this should increase productivity. Capital, just increasing the level of investment, that could be determined by the interest rate, of course, and lots of other factors, but investment in research and development or advances in technology should be able to increase the quality. Enterprise should be increased by privatisation and reduction in rules and regulations, so deregulation and government incentives to start businesses such as grants, and quality education and training should encourage the quality of your enterprise. So lots of factors there that could increase aggregate supply. So we can see changes in aggregate supply. The good thing about changes, an increase in aggregate supply, is that you get an increase in real GDP, I'll come back to employment and unemployment, but you get this increase in real GDP, but you actually get a decrease in your price level. So you technically on the diagram it's showing deflation there, but more likely to be disinflation in reality. And in a decrease in aggregate supply means that you get a reduction in real GDP and actually an increase in inflation. But in terms of employment, well, we know more factors of production are being used at this point. So either the quality or the quantity is increased. So employment should have increased, but unemployment, I'm not too sure about, because it's the distance between the maximum full capacity and the point you're actually at that represents unemployment. So it depends whether the distance between that vertical point there and there is larger or smaller than, it seems like it's actually larger than the distance between that vertical point there and that point. So actually that would represent a bit of an increase in unemployment. What I suspect happened in that economy is you've attracted people into the labour force, but some of them haven't actually got jobs. That's actually happened in our economy over the last year. The A2 students are studying that at the moment. So we've had an increase in employment as well as an increase in unemployment. So macroeconomic equilibrium is a situation where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply and real GDP is not changing. This is the Keynesian view of it, at least, anyway. So that's what it looks like. And the effect of a change in aggregate supply will depend upon, it says 3, depends upon 2 things, because we don't have the multiplier for this one. 1, the size of the change, so the larger the shift in AS, the larger the effect on the economy. And 2, the original level of economic activity. So let's show you some diagrams here. So here we've got a diagram with aggregate supply increasing, but we've got an economy with a lot of spare capacity. So we have no change in real GDP and the price level. But actually what we've done is we've encouraged people to come into the labour market without actually having jobs for them. So we get an increase in unemployment. Here we get a change. But here, what's happening here? We get a bigger change. I think that's meant to show than this one here. So we get the biggest increase in real GDP where the economy is operating near to full capacity. Okay, so output gaps. This is more significant in the A2 course, but is shown in the AS book, so I'll just go over it. It's the difference between actual real GDP and potential real GDP. So potential is where your AS goes vertical, and actual is where AD crosses AS. So if you've got a negative output gap, which is what most economies produce at, it means that actual real GDP is smaller than potential real GDP, and it just means you've got unemployed resources. If you've got a positive output gap, it means that actual real GDP, this makes more sense to be honest when you're looking at the neoclassical model, but I've tried to draw it on this one. If you've got actual real GDP larger than potential real GDP, and you might think, you what? How do you get that? But it's where you're working your workers overtime, so they couldn't continue working like that forever. But in the short term, you could produce outside your production possibility curve, so to speak. So you can produce out here, but in the long run, you'd have to be back here, and it is quite inflationary. The effect's quite inflationary on your economy. So let's have a few different look at a few different scenarios. So using an AD-AS diagram, analyse the effects on fall in exports and economy. That was in the other presentation. So you're probably going to get something like this, and we have deflation there, or disinflation, or fall in the price level, fall in real GDP. Why do we have that? Because exports are a component of AD. Next one then, using AD-AS, analyse the effects of an increase in investment on the economy. Interesting one, this one. So it's a component of AD, so we know it's going to increase AD. But investment actually increases the quality and quantity of capital as well, so it increases AS as well. So that's good. Yay! AD-AS, analyse the effects of decrease in government spending. So government spending being a component of AD might also, in the long run, have a reduction in AS. You know, if the quality of labour decreases because they cut the spending on education, might decrease AS, so it's a bit of scope there for a bit of comment on analysis. Explain why an increase in aggregate demand may have no impact on the real GDP of an economy, because you might be operating at full capacity already. Using ADAS, explain why an increase in aggregate supply may have no impact on the real GDP of an economy, because you may be operating at very low capacity utilisation. Okay, so what we've covered, we've defined the aggregate supply, we've looked at why it might shift, so it's land, labour, capital and enterprise, changes in the quality and the quantity. We've looked at what a macroequilibrium is and why it might change. It's just caused by any changes in AD or AS. And so we've covered all of the specification objectives except for this one, which is covered in the next presentation.